I was working the night shift at my local Wal-Bombs back when it still stayed open 24 hours a day. Most nights were painfully slow, usually fewer than 10 customers during my entire shift. Still, management didn't want us standing around, so whenever we weren't helping customers, we were expected to stock shelves. It was a large store, the kind where you'd sometimes go an entire hour without seeing another employee. Occasionally there might be someone in the back unloading inventory, or a cleaner sweeping through the aisles, but on this particular night, I was the only staff member in the entire building. I was working in the cereal aisle, breaking down boxes and organizing inventory, when I heard something fall over on the other side of the shelf in the next row. What made the sound unusual was that I hadn't heard the store's sliding doors open. They were extremely loud. No one entered without me noticing, so the idea that someone else was suddenly nearby threw me off. I leaned to my left to glance down the aisle and froze. A man stood at the end of the row, half in shadow, staring at me with an expression so blank it made my stomach knot. "Do you need something, sir?" I finally asked. No. Could you just point me to the eggs?" he said. His voice was strange, but his appearance is what unsettled me most. His face didn't look wrong exactly, just off. His upper lip seemed to jut out too far, giving him an odd cartoonish look, almost like a character from an animated show. The longer I looked at him, the more uncomfortable I felt. I hoped I wouldn't be the one to ring him up later. I rushed to finish stocking the aisle and loaded the last boxes into my U-bow cart. As I pushed it toward the back room, the same man suddenly stepped into my path, cutting me off. He must have slipped through the middle aisle to intercept me. He looked to be in his mid-30s. At the time I was only 22, though I looked younger, and something about his presence made my skin crawl. He tried striking up small talk, but it quickly became intrusive. First he asked my name, then my age, where I went to school, why I worked the night shift. Harmless questions at first, but delivered with a strange eagerness that made me uneasy. Then he shifted into creepier territory, asking whether I went to parties, whether I had a girlfriend, and finally, whether I'd ever had a boyfriend. As he asked this, he placed his hand on my shoulder. Every instinct in me recoiled. "I'm not into whatever you're thinking," I said sharply, pulling away. I pushed the cart faster, almost jogging toward the back room. He followed me for several aisles until I ducked into the stockroom. He didn't step inside, thankfully. I stayed there catching my breath, trying to decide what to do. We weren't supposed to remain in the back for long, since it left the floor unmonitored for theft, but I didn't care. After a minute, I thought it was best to wait at the register so I could ring him up quickly and get him out of the store. But 20 minutes passed. He never appeared. I figured he had left or stolen whatever he wanted and slipped out. Either way, I was relieved the encounter seemed over, until I remembered I needed to use the bathroom. I jogged to the employee restroom at the back of the store. Moments after I sat down, the bathroom door creaked open. My heart dropped. I swallowed the urge to shout, not wanting to give away my exact position. Slowly, I lifted my feet off the floor so they wouldn't be visible beneath the stall door. And then, horrifyingly, I saw an eye appear in the narrow gap of the stall door, staring directly at me. I screamed. I froze in the bathroom stall, staring at that eye peering through the crack, my whole body shaking so violently I could barely think. For several seconds I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't process the fact that the same man from earlier had somehow followed me all the way to the back of the store and into the employee bathroom, a place customers weren't even allowed to enter. I knew I had only one chance to do something before he tried to force the stall open. My hands were trembling, but I reached into my pocket and wrapped my fingers around the box cutter I carried for opening stock. Without saying a word, I shoved the blade through the crack in the door, forcing him to jerk his head back. The second he moved away, I kicked the stall door with everything I had. It slammed into him with a dull thud, and I bolted past him without looking back. My legs were shaking so badly I nearly tripped, but adrenaline pushed me forward. I sprinted out of the bathroom, down the hallway, through the aisles, and straight out the front doors into the freezing night air. I didn't stop running until I was halfway across the parking lot, gasping for breath, feeling like I could collapse. I grabbed my phone and called my boss, 5 times before he answered, and when he finally picked up, I choked out everything that happened. He told me to call the police, and I did, pacing by the curb, scanning the dark windows of the store in case the man appeared again. By the time the cops arrived, He was gone without a trace. They searched the store, the lot, and the nearby streets but found nothing. I worked the night shift only 2 more times after that, before I requested a permanent schedule change. Thankfully, I never saw that man again. I wish the rest of my night shift experiences had been any less disturbing, but after leaving Wall Bombs, I ended up working at a gas station on a rural highway, the kind of place where the silence at night feels heavier than the darkness itself. The shift was from midnight to 6 a.m., and on most nights maybe 1 or 2 people would stop by for gas or snacks. It was repetitive, boring, and lonelier than I expected, but I needed the paycheck after college, especially since my boss paid an extra $5 an hour for the graveyard shift. On one freezing December night, I was passing time by flipping through the newspaper and playing games on my phone when I saw headlights pull into the lot. A red pickup truck parked by the pumps, and a tall man stepped out. I glanced up a few times, expecting him to start pumping gas or walk inside, but instead he stood absolutely still, staring at the pump like he had no idea what he was doing. Something felt off, but I tried to be professional. When I looked again, he slowly turned his head toward me in one rigid motion. Even through the glass, even with the lighting, I couldn't see his face. Just pure darkness, no features, no eyes, nothing. I pretended to ignore him, though my heart was hammering. When I looked up again, the man had moved closer to the door without making a sound, still staring, still motionless. A cold wave of dread washed over me, and I walked to the entrance and locked it, flipping the sign to closed even though it wasn't. I sat behind the counter, hiding behind storage bins so I wouldn't have to see him, texting every friend I had just to feel less alone. After 5 agonizing minutes, I finally worked up the courage to peek over the counter, and there he was, standing directly in front of the glass door, inches away from me. I screamed and grabbed the phone, calling the police. The dispatcher clearly thought I was overreacting, but I begged them to send someone. While I was on the floor behind the counter, curled into myself, I heard loud thuds at the door. Heavy, violent, deliberate attempts to break in. Then suddenly the banging stopped. I heard a vehicle start up, tires crunch on gravel, and when I looked, the truck was gone. Minutes later, a patrol car and a state trooper arrived. I told them everything, the red truck, the man, the direction he drove off. But I couldn't describe his face because I hadn't seen one. And since he technically hadn't committed a crime, there was little they could do. I quit that job a few months later and moved to the city, hoping I'd left those kinds of nights behind. Not long after leaving the gas station job, I found myself working another night shift, this time at a 7-Eleven on a quiet rural road. It wasn't as isolated as the highway station, and the store usually got a steady trickle of people even past midnight. On any given night, maybe 10 to 20 customers would stop by for beer, snacks, or cigarettes. It was simple work, long hours, but predictable, until one night when everything changed. Sometime after midnight, a man in his mid-20s wandered into the store. The moment he stepped inside, he started making loud, strange noises, almost like screaming, but not quite words. At first, I assumed he had a developmental disability. My brother has one, so I instinctively felt sympathy rather than fear. But as the man approached the counter, something about him didn't feel right. His head tilted forward, his eyes focused not on me but on the ceiling above me, as if he was watching something I couldn't see. Every attempt I made to talk to him was met with those same loud noises. No words, no gestures, no signs of understanding. I kept glancing toward the parking lot, hoping someone might be waiting for him outside, but there were no cars. He must have walked there alone. He stood at the counter for so long, staring upward and making those unsettling sounds, that I finally tried handing him a bag of chips and gently urging him to leave, hoping maybe it would calm him. I even searched behind the counter for a number to call, anything that might help someone get him home safely. Then, without warning, he turned around and walked out. No goodbye, no acknowledgement, not even a glance in my direction. I felt guilty for being relieved, yet at the same time the whole encounter had left me deeply unsettled. An hour passed before the store phone rang. I picked it up and froze the moment I heard those same loud, wordless noises coming through the receiver. For a second, I couldn't even speak. It felt too bizarre to be real, like some twisted prank. I hung up immediately, shaking, and spent the next hour trying to ignore the paranoid feeling that he might be somewhere outside watching the store. By the time the next employee arrived to take over the shift at 4 a.m., I was exhausted and ready to collapse into bed. I drove home trying to convince myself that the phone call had been a coincidence or maybe even a wrong number. But as soon as I stepped inside my house, literally within a minute, my phone rang again. I stared at the caller ID with a sick feeling spreading through my chest. 4 in the morning. No one calls at that time unless something is wrong. I answered, bracing for bad news, and instead heard those same loud, choking, unnatural noises. The same man, the same sounds. Somehow he had my phone number. I slammed the phone down, my hands shaking uncontrollably. All night I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was inside the house with me. Every creak, every tap, every shift in the air made my heart leap. I barely slept until sunlight finally crept through the blinds. With the passing of weeks, the fear faded, and eventually I stopped thinking about the man altogether. But then one afternoon I went down to the basement, a place I rarely visited, and instantly felt something was wrong. Papers were scattered across the floor as if someone had rummaged through them. My stomach dropped as I stepped toward the basement closet. When I opened it, the breath left my lungs. Words were written all over the closet walls in Sharpie. 7-Eleven, the exact address of the store I worked at, and worst of all, my home address. Beneath those words sat a collection of kitchen knives and a large pocket knife, all arranged neatly, as if waiting for someone to pick one up. It became painfully clear that the man from the store had been living in my basement. Not just lurking nearby, actually living beneath my home for who knows how long. Every sound I thought I imagined, he had likely caused. Every shiver of paranoia had been a warning I didn't understand. And yet, for reasons I still can't make sense of, he left. He vanished without taking anything, without harming me, without being seen again. I never received another call. I never heard another noise from downstairs. But the memory of that closet, the writing on the wall, and the knives arranged so deliberately will haunt me forever. That man wasn't just unstable, he was dangerously ill, and the fact that he chose to leave instead of doing something worse is the only reason I'm still here telling the story. I've worked in the K-9 unit for nearly a decade now, and across those years I've had my fair share of eerie nights, strange encounters, and unsettling moments on the job, but none of them compare to one particular night, an experience that still sits heavy in my chest whenever I think about it. I was paired with Sammy, my German shepherd, who was 2 years old at the time and still newer to fieldwork, energetic and impulsive but smart and fiercely protective. We were patrolling a long stretch of rural road bordered by endless fields of crops. It was the sort of landscape that feels peaceful in the daytime, but transforms into something unnerving once darkness settles over it. As I drove, my headlights caught the shape of a white van parked deep inside the crops, far off the road. Both of its doors were wide open. It immediately set off alarms in my mind, not the casual someone pulled over kind of suspicion, but something sharper and more dangerous. I flashed my lights a few times, hoping whoever was inside might come out and explain themselves, but no one moved. Not a single shadow shifted. So I pulled over, grabbed my flashlight, and let Sammy out of the back seat. The moment we stepped into the field, I could feel the atmosphere change. Sammy's posture stiffened, her ears alert, her breathing faster than normal. She sensed something before I did. We made our way to the van, and the smell hit me the second I opened the trunk. A heavy, suffocating wave of rot that nearly knocked me backward. It was the sort of odor that sticks to your throat and refuses to let you breathe. I lifted my flashlight with a shaking hand and counted them. 7 body bags, each zipped except for the bottom, where pairs of pale feet were sticking out. For a few seconds, I couldn't think. I could only hear the blood rushing in my ears. I radioed for immediate backup, my voice barely steady enough to speak clearly. Before dispatch could even respond, I heard a twig snap somewhere behind us. Sammy snapped into a frenzy, pulling so hard on her leash that she nearly tore it from my hand. She growled, barked, lunged, her instincts screaming before mine even caught up. When the sound repeated, closer this time, I let her lead the direction, but I could barely keep up with her speed. I pushed through rows of crops that slapped against my face, each one making me flinch, half expecting a hand to reach out at any moment. The barking grew louder, then suddenly stopped. That silence was worse than the noise. It was like the entire field was holding its breath. I stood frozen, listening. Then I realized something horrifying. The movement I heard around me wasn't coming from one direction. It was coming from all directions. Subtle rustling behind me, sharper movement to my left, slow shifting straight ahead. I had never felt fear like that, not even in training scenarios. I lifted my weapon, trying to pinpoint a target, but the crops made everything sound closer than it really was. Then, without warning, two strong arms wrapped around my throat from behind. The hold was tight, cutting off my air instantly. My gun fell from my hand, my vision blurred. I thought I was going to die there in that field. But then I heard Sammy's bark, loud, furious, violent. The man choking me screamed as she sank her teeth into his leg. I didn't think, I reacted. I picked up my gun from the dirt, spun around, and fired. The man collapsed and Sammy growled, refusing to let go of his pant leg until she was sure he couldn't get up again. I grabbed her leash and ran, full sprint, through the crops until we burst out onto the road. My lungs burned, my hands shook, my entire body felt like it was vibrating. I knew we were being followed. I could hear footsteps in the field, faint but unmistakable. I got us into the car, slammed the door shut, and drove a quarter-mile down the road before I dared to stop. I didn't look back, didn't try to confront whoever else was out there. Call it cowardice if you want. I've called myself a coward for years because of that night. Backup arrived minutes later, but by then the van was gone. Vanished. No tire tracks, no plates, nothing. Even the body bags were missing. I didn't capture any identifying information. No plate number, no dashcam footage clear enough to use. It was one of my first months on the force, but I still felt like I had failed everyone. My training, the victims in those bags, the officers who trusted me, even Sammy. I tell myself I saved our lives that night, that fleeing was the only choice that kept us alive. But there isn't a week that goes by where I don't think about the killers in that field, the ones who got away because I ran. In the years that followed, I tried to convince myself that the nightmares from that night would fade, that the faces I never saw and the voices I never heard would eventually lose their grip on my mind. But fear doesn't disappear just because time passes. It settles deep into the places you don't expect, the corners of your memory you can't clean out. Every night shift I worked after that felt different, heavier somehow, as if the darkness itself was watching me. The cases I responded to, even the routine ones, carried a tension I couldn't shake. Sometimes when Sammy and I patrolled quiet streets or drove along back roads, she would sit up suddenly, ears stiff, growling at something in the distance. And every time she did, my heart pounded the same way it had that night in the crops. You learn in this line of work to trust your partner's instincts more than your own. But you also learn that danger doesn't always show its face. Often it hides, waits, circles, and bides its time. That understanding changes something in you. It changes the way you walk into rooms, the way you notice shadows, the way you sleep, the way you never really sleep. Still, I kept working, kept patrolling, kept pretending I was fine because I believed facing the night was better than running from it. But the truth is, every story from those years taught me a separate lesson. The man in the grocery store taught me how quickly a quiet shift can turn violent. The man at the gas station taught me how terror can stand perfectly still and yet feel like it's moving toward you. The 7-Eleven stranger taught me how horror can follow you home without ever opening your door. And that night in the crops taught me that evil isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's silent, patient, and organized. Sometimes it leaves nothing behind except questions that can never be answered. Each moment carved away at any illusion I had about safety or predictability. Even now, when I look back, it's not the violence that haunts me most. It's the moments right before the violence, the stillness, the silence, the feeling of something wrong slipping into the room before you notice it. It's the memory of people who didn't deserve what happened to them, and the gut-wrenching truth that sometimes you can't save everyone, no matter how much you want to. When I finally left night shift work, I thought stepping away would bring closure or at least distance. It didn't. The world looks different when you've seen what hides behind unlocked doors and dimly lit aisles. You carry those moments with you, even in daylight, even in crowded places where nothing feels dangerous. Sometimes a passerby's blank stare brings back the grocery aisle. Sometimes a truck slowing on the road reminds me of the gas station. Sometimes a strange noise in the house triggers a rush of memories from that basement closet. And every time I drive past open fields, my eyes drift to the crops without meaning to, searching for that white van even though I know it's long gone. Fear changes shape, but it doesn't disappear. It simply learns to live quietly inside you. And yet, after everything, the conclusion I've come to isn't about fear at all. It's about awareness. It's about understanding that danger doesn't always announce itself, that people can hide unimaginable intentions behind the most ordinary faces, that the places we consider safe can become unfamiliar in an instant. But it's also about survival, instinct, and the strange strength you discover only when you're pushed to your breaking point. Every night I walked away from, every shift I survived, every moment I trusted my instincts, they taught me that fear isn't always your enemy. Sometimes it's the one thing that keeps you alive, and maybe that's why these stories still matter. Not because of the horror they held, but because of the reminder they leave behind. The world is darker than it appears, but awareness, true awareness, is a kind of light. The kind that keeps you standing, breathing, moving forward, no matter what waits in the shadows.